Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's session, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can type and read messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you'll use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speakers. We'll be breaking for discussion several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. If you run into technical problems, you can request help in the box labeled Type Here for Technical Help. Someone will contact you directly to help solve your problem. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSWebinar. That's NCCPSWebinar. If you miss part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded and captioned. The link will be available on the NCCPS webinars page in about a week. Watch your email also for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's session. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now for our presentation. Today we're going to hear about the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative and the importance of recognizing and reporting suspicious activity to prevent violence targeting educational facilities. The NSI is a joint collaborative effort by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, fusion centers, and state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement partners that has established a standardized process for identifying and reporting suspicious activity in jurisdictions across the country. We have 3 speakers to talk about this important initiative, all senior research associates with IIR, the Institute for Intergovernmental Research. Phil Raymer served more than 30 years with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement before retiring in 2004. He was the principal author of the reports that led to the implementation of the NSI and currently conducts advanced research and coordinates and facilitates a number of projects for the Institute for Intergovernmental Research. Monte McKee retired from the Indiana State Police after 33 years and has served in several positions relating to Homeland Security and information sharing, including membership on the Interagency Threat Assessment and Coordination Group at the National Counterterrorism Center. With IIR, he conducts privacy reviews and leads a national effort to develop a guidance document on threat assessments. Jennifer Skinner is a member of the Technical Assistance Team for the NSI, focusing on policy issues relating to the protection of privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. She provides policy guidance, training, and technical assistance to federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial agencies to help law enforcement understand how to deal with suspicious activity with a potential nexus to terrorism while protecting privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. Phil, Monte, and Jennifer, welcome to Campus Public Safety Online. Phil, I believe you're going to kick things off.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone to this webinar presentation on the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. We hopefully this will be very informative, and we really want to highlight what your role is in how we collect information in this country, how we report it, and how we share the information. So today we're going to talk about a national framework of how this works. It's been set up for some time. It works very well, but we want to make sure everyone understands that framework and, again, how you fit into that process as we go through this. So for today's agenda, I'm going to begin and give you a quick overview of the NSI, sort of how we got to where we are now, what some of the basic rules are on how we share the information, some basic definitional items, and then we'll move on, and Monte McKee will talk to us about the actual SAR process, how the 16 behaviors that you hear us talking about, the pre-operational planning behaviors, fit in, what they are, and how all this works together. And then last, Jennifer Skinner, who's an attorney that works with us, will talk about privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties issues. As we know, anytime the government collects information on anybody, we have to be concerned about privacy concerns and make sure that we have those things covered. So I put this slide real quick just to show you some different logos here to show that this is a joint project with a lot of agencies. It's not just one agency who develops something and trying to get everybody else to use it. So all the federal agencies are represented here. We have the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, and other organizations that all came together to develop and agree to this process. And if you'll notice in the top right-hand corner there's an icon called ISE. And many of you probably have never seen that before, never heard of it. It's a relatively new federal entity that was created for the primary purpose of solving information sharing problems as related to terrorism among all agencies, not just the federal agencies, but also state and local agencies as well as private entities and others. So we'll talk some about them as we go through our process today. So our primary objectives are to talk about the background, give you a little guidance on that. We're going to talk about something called the ISE-SAR functional standard. That's the Information Sharing Environment Suspicious Activity Reporting Functional Standard, and that's the guidance that we use to go through this process. And we want to talk a little bit about the training that's available to everybody on a public website. We want to summarize how this relates to colleges and universities to make sure that you understand your role and how important that is. Talk some about the role of fusion centers. We'll talk about what those are, and also the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces and how this process is set up to make sure the information gets to those entities so that it can be shared and distributed and followed up appropriately. As I indicated, what the ISE functional standard we'll talk about in detail, and then we'll talk about the privacy concerns as we go through these issues. So real quick, a basic timeline here to sort of show you how we got to where we are. So starting on the left, we had the attacks on 9/11. I think most of you probably know about that, and how that dramatically changed really our whole world, everybody's world, and how we view things in law enforcement, how we gather information, how we share it, and how we look out for each other. So after the 9/11 attacks, there were a number of commissions and reports that came out talking about things that we could do to try to prevent additional attacks. And one of the biggest concerns expressed was the lack of information sharing or protocols for making sure information got to where it needed to be. So in 2004, Congress passed a law called the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, otherwise known as IRPTA by its acronym, to try to address a lot of those issues. And in the information sharing arena, they did a number of things. They reorganized the national intelligence community, created the Director of National Intelligence, and they created this office called the Information Sharing Environment. And their role was to try to set up the guidelines and solve all of the information sharing problems that had not worked as we'd like them to before 9/11, to try and solve some of these issues. And it's been an ongoing effort involving a lot of agencies and a lot of people, but there's been a lot of agreement on it. So that's how we got to where we are with the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative to be able to share that information. Now in 2006, 2007, states were developing something called fusion centers. You may or may not be familiar with those. So those are little intelligence operations. All the states have them, 22 of the major metropolitan areas have them, and their goal was to make sure that terrorism-related information got shared and processed and reacted to in every state. We all understood that the handful of federal agencies could not do everything in the whole country because most of law enforcement in this country obviously is state and local, and they had to be involved in it. So fusion centers were developed to do that, and they came up with certain guidelines on how they would handle information. And then the information sharing environment developed what's known as the ISE-SAR functional standard in 2008, and that laid out the guidance in how the information should be shared. And we'll go in a little more detail on exactly what that is, but this goes back to that date. And then later on in 2010, the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative, or NSI, was formally created, led primarily by DHS and the FBI, along with the fusion centers, to institutionalize this process throughout the country. And we involved all the fusion centers and state and local law enforcement to develop this process. And then in going on to 2014, there were several systems in place before that, so everybody agreed to use one system from that date on. It's on the SAR Data Repository, which actually uses FBI's eGuardian system to be able to share the information. Those of you on the call who are law enforcement agencies, you can actually get to that system if you desire over the Law Enforcement Enterprise Portal run by the FBI, and it's available to everybody. And then lastly, in 2015, the SAR functional standard was updated the last time to add some definitions, and we'll go over some of those things. So that's just a brief timeline to show you sort of where we started and where we are now and how we got there. So I talked a lot about the ISE-SAR functional standard, and talk a little bit about what that is. So this lays out a two-step process for determining whether terrorism-related suspicious activity needs to be processed and put into a national system and shared with everybody. So that two-step process is one, determining whether or not the activity that was observed is one of 16 behaviors that have been defined by experts as pre-operational activities related to terrorism. We'll go over those, Monty will go over those in detail later on. The two steps are, one, determining whether or not it meets that, and the other is a potential activity that's pre-operational planning related to terrorism. So if it meets the two steps, one of the 16 behaviors, and you believe it's pre-operational planning to terrorism, then it meets the standard for sharing the information. So here's a couple of quick definitions. Suspicious activity reports, we all know what those are. That's when you report suspicious activity. What we're going to talk about today is the ISE suspicious activity report, or terrorism-related suspicious activity reporting. As I indicated, this is pursuant to that two-step process to determine if there's a potential nexus to terrorism, to say if the information should be shared. It also has to take into consideration privacy, civil liberty, and some other areas before we can report it, track it, and put it in the national system. So when we talk about potential terrorist activity, we use the term, is it reasonably indicative of operational activity to get the standard as to whether or not it should be shared. And sometimes that's a little bit confusing to people. So this is the definition that came out in the latest version of the functional standard. And as you can see, it's not a real high bar. You don't have to prove it's terrorism. You don't have to have probable cause to believe it. It just says any circumstances when viewed by a reasonable observer, including law enforcement and security, who has an articulable concern that the behavior may be indicative of pre-operational planning related to terrorism or other criminal activity, then it's okay to share that information. So again, not a high standard. It can't be mere suspicion. It can't be like a gut hunch or something like that. It has to be something you can articulate, but if a reasonable person believes it may be pre-operational planning related to terrorism based on some, again, articulable concern, then it meets the standard for sharing that information. So this is to try to visualize that little timeline, that progression of information. Starting at the left is like no information. Starting at the right, it would be 100% certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. I think we all understand those concepts. So if you see at the left, mere suspicion, it's just you don't have anything factual, you just suspect somebody. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about reasonably indicative, which means just a little bit more information, something you can articulate. And then we go on up the line to reasonable suspicion, probable cause, we're all aware of. That's what it takes to get an arrest warrant and things like that. Reasonable suspicion is what it takes to do a stop and frisk and to get information in a criminal intelligence database. So it's not a whole lot of information, but it does have to be something we can articulate, but we don't have to prove it. So I want to make sure that's clear. So looking at how this whole process should work, there's a funnel slide up here where we try to look at how the information flows, starting with the general public, and it's wide open at one end, and this information sort of funnels down to the end result here on the other end. And I want to go through these real quick with you. So hold on a second. For some reason, my slide's not coming up.
They're advancing they're advancing to the public. Your network connection may have gotten a little slow. So they are advancing. Right now you are displaying slide 16, Phil.
Okay.
How about you, if I tell you, which slide would you like displayed? The next to last, the next to last segment in your diagram. INA, SAR. Go ahead.
One says Homeland Partners.
Phil, you might try slide 11 and just take it from there.
Okay, it's still not coming up. So Homeland Security Partners are those other people that the public will likely report information to, like firefighters, EMS, security, Crime Stoppers, people like that. So we want to make sure that they get that information and those people get trained. So we've got some online training that we have developed with them also, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to make sure that they're aware of it. So the next slide would be line officers or police officers. Like any crime or potential crime, we want people to report it to law enforcement because they're the ones that are trained to get the information. They're the ones that have to do something with it. And we developed the line officer training, which is a short video. We've had over 400,000 people trained in that now, which we'd really like to get everybody, every law enforcement officer to be aware of, so they understand what the 16 behaviors are and what they need to look at and what they need to do with that information. And so then the officers, law enforcement, passes it on to either one of the state or regional fusion centers or the FBI JTTF, which are located all over the country. So their role is to take that information that's come in, determine if it meets the two-step process laid out in the functional standard, and then share that information with everybody else. The next step in this is once it gets to JTTF and FBI and DHS, is to decide what needs to be done with this information, and the end result of that are investigations and intelligence reporting back to us in the public. So we developed training to try to help with all of these different segments, but I hope you sort of see the visualization of how we anticipate this information flowing all the way through the system. Okay, the next slide I've got up now is an overview of some of the online training that's available. I hope you make note of the site up top, nsi.ncirc.gov, which is where this online training is. It's public. It's not, you don't have to get a secure site to get it. But there's training on there. These are all like 15 to 18 minutes long, and they're designed for different segments: line officers, private security, fire, EMS, maritime, emergency management, public safety telecommunicators, 911 operators, and people like that. So if you know people that are, if you're involved with people in that world, we really encourage you to refer them to these sites to be able to look at that information. Okay, the one that's really important today for us, I hope, is the line officer training. We really encourage everybody on this call to both look at that and get all of your colleagues to look at it also, because it does a real good job of very briefly describing those 16 behaviors and describing the two-step process and what needs to be done with that. Okay, and that concludes my section. Do we have any questions?
Well, we've got some questions that are coming in from the web and from the webinar room. If you do have questions or comments for our speakers, type them into that chat pod that says questions and comments. We'll address them during some of the pauses that we have scheduled. But to keep on schedule, let me just get one question in here right now. And how do I know if the ISE functional standard applies to my campus?
So the functional standard applies to everybody, but what we try to tell people in law enforcement is to pass the information on. The functional standard is really something that the fusion centers and the JTTFs use to evaluate the information to determine whether or not it should be shared nationwide. You need to understand what they are, how they work, but don't be too concerned about trying to evaluate the information. If you have information you think is potentially terrorism information, it's one of those activities, then we encourage you to report the information, and somebody at the fusion centers or the JTTF we'll make the determination if it should be shared in the nationwide system.
Thanks so much, Phil. Now somebody out there is getting some audio in their background. If you can turn that off, that would be great. But in the meantime, Monte, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to talk a little more specifically about how the SAR process actually works and try to bring into the discussion where the college, university, security agencies, police departments, just in general, fit in. I think everyone on this call should definitely be familiar with the If You See Something, Say Something campaigns by now. See Something, Say Something is a initiative, a campaign that's offered and managed by DHS, partnering with local entities in your community, maybe in your college or campus setting. You may have posters that you see there with the See Something, Say Something logo on it, encouraging really the general public to report any suspicious activity. Routinely, those posters will have a phone number on there, a method by which to report that information. And so this is really a public-facing campaign that really gets the message out about suspicious activity reporting. Turning to a more specific discussion about the SAR process then is really where the NSI kicks in. The See Something, Say Something campaign, of course, generates a lot of tips and leads as it relates to pre-operational planning for terrorism. And so I'd like to walk you through this SAR process just a little bit to make sure you understand where you can fit in that process. You see at the top where it starts with observation, the diagram really highlights that, literally a suspicious activity could be observed by anyone. It could be a law enforcement officer doing his normal duties on patrol. Could be by a private citizen, in your case maybe a student or anyone on your college campuses. Or it might actually be a federal law enforcement officer performing their routine duties. So somewhere, someone will observe something suspicious. And because we're much more attuned to suspicious activity now, then that generally results in a report that gets forwarded. And the place to forward that, quite frankly, is to law enforcement. So anyone, anywhere seeing suspicious activity, they can follow the campaign posters. They might follow some local messaging. They might follow some employer directives or maybe in some campus or college directives. But routinely, those directives will give you a place to report that to. Once that report is made, then that report needs to get into the hands of law enforcement. And so that takes us to that second step. And whether it is a state and local law enforcement person or federal law enforcement person, that police officer or that federal agent will do some initial activities there that amounts to their initial response. Police officer on patrol may get that report, and that would be considered a police call for service. And they may actually roll out on that, talk to the caller, gather more information. If it pertains to a particular person, which routinely it does, they might look into their records to discover what additional information they might know about that person and about that suspicious activity report. Federal law enforcement essentially does the same. So after there's some initial assessment in the response and investigation, then the police agency, whether it be state or local, will make a determination based on their standard operating procedures about whether or not they should generate a suspicious activity report. And the point at which they do generate a suspicious activity report, then that begins that process of forwarding that report to the ISE, so to speak. And in this case, you see there's a variety of green arrows there, and there's a variety of mechanisms by which that suspicious activity report can be plugged in, so to speak. It could be simply picking up the phone call, picking up the phone and calling the Fusion Center or field office. It can be using e-guarding, the NSI SAR data repository. It can be put into a computer system that way. And we really don't care whether it goes to the Fusion Center or the JTTF field office. The point is we want it to go to one of those two locations. And so as Phil was describing about the impact of the ISE-SAR functional standard and the processing that occurs there with the NSI, it's really at that fusion center and that FBI field office layer that actual determination is assessed to determine how appropriate that record is for wide sharing, just exactly how critical that record might be, how quick actions may need to be taken on it. And so in a nutshell, this is the SAR process. And from a college or university perspective, the impact there is obviously could be at the observation stage. Okay, some student or a constituent at your location may see suspicious activity. That might get reported to your campus security or your campus police department, and as such, when that occurs, then it starts to begin that triage, that processing that you see represented here in this diagram. So I have emphasized the law enforcement role. Just know that when in the college or university setting, someone brings suspicious activity reporting to your attention, it's imperative that that make it to law enforcement. If you're a campus security, I can imagine that you have already a well-established relationship with your local law enforcement agency. If you're actually a campus police department, then you are in a position to begin that processing. Hopefully, in your role there, you've already developed a relationship with your fusion center and or the FBI JTTF. If in fact you have not, I would encourage you to do so. And in your role there, when that hits your layer for some local processing, know that we're interested in you adding everything you know about that potential suspicious activity to that record. So the context of the behavior, the facts that you would have to offer, and the circumstances that pertain to that suspicious activity report. And Steve, just so you know, I'm having technology problems as well, so I've got a white screen.
Okay, what slide would you like up?
Let's go with the National Fusion Center, and let me jump off.
Slide 25? That's slide
Yes,
25,
sir.
and that's on the screen right now.
Okay, and stand by. And so
just tell me when you want slides advanced, and I'll take care of it for you.
Okay, that'd be fine. We're in good shape here. So in the event that your college or university is not familiar with the location or who to contact at your representative fusion center, that information is available at this website, nfcausa.org. They have a real handy map there. You can go there, and all the access information is available there. And as I said before, I certainly encourage you to know who that is, to begin a relationship with your fusion center. Fusion centers have liaison officer programs, and they'll be very happy to inform you on what an opportunity that is for you to become a liaison to the fusion center. And in particular, once you're a liaison to the fusion center, that SAR process becomes very streamlined for you, and it's a good asset for you. Slide 26, please.
It's on the screen.
There you go. So fusion centers really came to forefront following 9/11. There are 79 of those state and local operated fusion centers across the country now, and it's their job to pull information in, to look to all the different public safety disciplines that are out there, and to make sure that that information is being appropriately handled and nothing slips through the cracks. So again, consider them a great asset to you. Reach out to them. Slide 27. And also the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The FBI has the lead responsibility for the investigation of terrorism across the country. There are 104 JTTFs established that involves the 56 field offices. The FBI is the lead agency for terrorism, and know that whether you're coordinating with your fusion center or the FBI JTTF, those are the locations that you need to make sure that your suspicious activity reporting is getting pushed to. 28. So first observers, we consider everybody a first observer. This is actually, without a doubt, a theme of the See Something, Say Something program. Know that in your college and university setting, you are likely in a good position to see suspicious activity. I hope that none of that is occurring where you work at, but I want to focus now actually on the indicators and behaviors so that in terms of what exactly is suspicious and how to identify it, you're better prepared to do that. Slide 29. Slide 29 is a picture of a downloadable item in your file share pod. We refer to as the 16 indicators or behaviors. And this downloadable item here will have the list of those 16. It'll give you some examples of what those 16 entail. It's not an all-inclusive examples. This is one of those things where categorically these are the 16 areas that we think are pertinent to pre-operational planning for a terrorist event now. But by all means, we know that terrorism is not a static threat issue. The threats from terrorism are evolving all the time. And as such, if you see something that is suspicious, you think there's a potential nexus to terrorism, get that in the hands of law enforcement so they can begin to look at it and resolve whether or not that's a legitimate threat issue. Slide 30, please. So slide 30 is a summary of these 16 behaviors. You see on the left-hand side at the title at the top, it says these are defined criminal activity and potential terrorism-related behaviors. As compared to the right side of the slide, it says potential criminal or non-criminal activities that may be suspicious. So in the national discussion that has occurred since 9/11 and analyzing the terrorist threat, this has been what the threat picture has been boiled down to as what we think are the prime indicators and behaviors, categorically speaking, that we need to inform the public on, and also that we need to utilize as we manage this idea of sharing this information throughout the NSI community. Slide 31, please. So, as was indicated on the previous slide, the first portion of those behaviors are routinely defined as criminal activities. So don't forget that if one of those behaviors is brought to your attention, that is likely a crime, and really your first call on this should be handled as any other crime report in your college or university. Recommend you call 911, get that in the hands of law enforcement right away. Slide 32. So as we look down through these indicators, and this first set of indicators being the indicators that are defined criminal in and of themselves, that list starts with a breach or attempted intrusion. I'm going to go fairly quickly through this list, but we know that our study of the terrorist events and what we know from analyzing the terrorist threat picture, that all these indicators can occur and are likely to occur, and we start with breach or attempted intrusion. Slide 33. Misrepresentation is the next one. We know that routinely misrepresentation through documents, through identification, is utilized, so misrepresentation. Slide 34. Theft, loss, or diversion. Criminals steal things. Terrorists steal things to perpetrate their criminal act. Slide 35. Sabotage, tampering, or vandalism. We know from prior studies of terrorist events that this is a common activity, a common behavior. So as such, if you see this behavior, not only is it a crime in and of itself, don't forget that that might be an indicator of a terrorist event and needs to be processed as a suspicious activity report. Slide 36. Cyberattack. We are really living in an age, I think it's very common for all of us to know that cyber issues are prevalent in the news today. We may in fact have challenges trying to figure out which ones are terrorist events and which ones are not. However, if you see a cyber attack of some nature and you believe there is a potential nexus to terrorism, not only is that a crime, but that should be documented as a SAR for further processing. Slide 37, please. Expressed or implied threat. Very common item today, especially with what we're seeing in social media. Not only is that likely a criminal event, that is also one that needs to be documented. Slide 38, aviation activity. Unfortunately, we know through the federal intelligence community that terrorist actors around the world are continuing to focus on aviation as a potential tactic or technique of a terrorist event. So anything that is a suspicious activity relative to aviation, Not only is it a crime, be sure that it's generated a SAR. Slide 39. So this next list I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but I just want you to understand that the next indicators may or may not be criminal. And as such, this is why it's critical to get this to law enforcement so they can look into that and to get the context, the facts, and the circumstances pinned down as accurately as they can to resolve that question of whether or not there is a potential nexus to terrorism. Many of these things in and of themselves may not be, that they can be constitutionally protected activities. However, we want to ensure that they are looked at appropriately, and in the event that there's articulable concern that they could be an event associated with pre-operational planning for terrorism, that they generate a report. And that first one in slide 40 is a listing information. Slide 41, testing or probing of security. Slide 42, recruiting or financing. Slide 43, photography. Slide 44, observation surveillance. Next, materials acquisition and storage. Slide 46, acquisition of expertise. Slide 47, weapons collection or discovery. Slide 48, sector-specific incident. And so we know that with special events and with special critical infrastructure sectors, that with the targeting that terrorists seek, that if an event actually is focused on one of those, if a behavior is actually focused at a sector-specific item, then there's a higher likelihood or a higher threat. Slide 49. So I would just encourage our audience here today to consider the question, do you actually have a SAR policy? Do you have a suspicious activity reporting policy? And in that policy, have you clarified under what circumstances that you actually document suspicious activity? Have you internally in your college campus environment, working with your campus security and with your campus and/or campus police department, have you defined that internal SAR workflow? And then following the diagram, as I explained earlier, have you incorporated the need to continue to process that SAR through all the appropriate entities, the Fusion Center and the JTTF, so that it actually gets in the hands of the FBI so that they can appropriately determine whether or not that suspicious activity report is worthy of further investigation. And finally, that I know Jen will cover as we close out our webinar today, but have you actually evaluated the privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties protections that you want to include in your policy? So, Steve, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
Tremendous. Thanks, Monte, and thanks for keeping us on our timeline despite those technical problems. Question, how do I contact my local JTTF, and in particular, is there a Fusion Center in Alaska? Monte?
So the local JTTF, there are 56 field offices, and I would encourage our audience to go to fbi.gov. They have an excellent public-facing website there. The contact information is available there for all 56 of those offices. And if our webinar today generates more questions and would like to have the FBI involved in those questions, feel free to give them a call. But that information is available there. And yes, Alaska has a Fusion Center.
Can the indicators and examples handout that's downloadable in the file share pod be copied and used for local outreach?
By all means. That's the reason they are there. And we certainly encourage all our participants today to download that. It is a PDF. We would ask that you try not to alter it or change it. That's went through a quite lengthy approval process, as you can imagine, but feel free to utilize that in your outreach, in particular for your law enforcement and campus security entities there. We love to have that out there.
So a relatively long question from Gabriel Mikas, I'm pronouncing that as best I can. Should we extend the level of suspicious activities and in virtual campus environments as well? For example, when a highly demanded course or class attracted by a sensitive technological curriculum, suspicious participants could be a danger, morphing in a way even courseware, honeypots, cybersecurity. I'm going to try to summarize this if I'm understanding it. You can imagine cyber courses on campus that actually talk about activities which could then be used for negative purposes. How do you look at those types of issues?
So I think my short answer on that is that we could see an indicator or behavior of pre-operational planning revealed by all sorts of media. It could be a person just by their mere actions. It can be by a statement they make face-to-face somewhere. It can be by actual statements that someone overhears. It likewise can be that same type of indicator or behavior that might be evident in virtual communications. We of course see what the impact is of social media these days, and so by any medium, if someone suspects that there is an indicator or behavior of pre-operational planning for a terrorist activity, then I would encourage that person to report that, get that in the hands of law enforcement, then let law enforcement run with that to really determine whether or not that's a valid concern or not.
Let me squeeze in one more question during this break before we give the floor over to Jennifer. I'm not sure if the information I have received from a student about potential terrorism precursor activities meets the functional standard. What should I do?
So I want to clarify that the functional standard, although it does apply to everybody in general, it is a public-facing standard. We by all means are very transparent on this standard. The two-step process of making that decision of whether or not a suspicious activity report is something to be shared widely, that really occurs at the Fusion Center level or the FBI level. So our message, I think, to our audience today is that if you see what you think is suspicious activity, and in particular, if it involves one of these 16 behavior categories we reviewed, then generate a report on that, get it to your law enforcement, referring back to that SAR process diagram, then let them decide what to do with it further. As far as whether or not it meets the ISE-SAR functional standard, that'll come at the bottom of that diagram at the Fusion Center or the FBI.
Thanks, Monty. So we're now going to give the floor over to Jennifer. Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the core privacy, civil rights, civil liberties protections that have been built into the NSI framework. These protections improve the quality of our information, reinforce the mission effectiveness of law enforcement, and protect privacy, civil rights, civil liberties. But I'd also like you to keep in mind the risk of harm that may occur. If these protections are ignored and the information about individuals in your community is inappropriately gathered, documented, and shared, then it's possible that fundamental constitutional rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and equal protection may be implicated. And the risk of harm to the individual may be greater if it's broadly shared. Now, the NSI guidance that we're going to be discussing is known as the ISE-SAR Functional Standard. It's guidance that has been adopted by the functional standard, by the Fusion Centers, and it's incorporated in the Fusion Center privacy policies. So let's talk about the term privacy. Privacy is a broad concept. In the words of Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, privacy protects the right to be let alone. If you go looking for this term, you will not find an explicit right to privacy in the U.S. Constitution. It is not specifically mentioned in the Bill of Rights. However, certain aspects of privacy are protected by various constitutional amendments, specifically the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments. Now keep in mind, privacy is fundamental to our way of life. It is fundamental to a democratic society under limited government. So for purposes of our discussion today, we'll be focusing on information privacy. This term is, or information privacy is, inferred through case law, reflected in the Fair Information Practice Principles, and the Privacy Act of 1974. and it's incorporated in the privacy policies within the government and the private sector. The aspect of privacy that we'll be discussing today focuses on the individual's right to control his or her personal information. In particular, his or her ability to prevent the inappropriate gathering, collection, use, and release of his or her personally identifiable information, also known as PII. So what is PII? PII is information that can be used to identify an individual. It's really important for you to be alert to the presence of PII. That's because PII is the primary trigger for the privacy protections and privacy policies. So I recommend that all of you closely review your organization's privacy policy again and make sure that you understand and adhere to it. Among other things, the policy will help you understand how to collect, use, and share PII appropriately. Now on this point, please keep in mind that participation in the NSI does not confer additional authorities on you. You have to collect and use and share PII in accordance with applicable laws, regulations, and policies. The privacy policy will also explain how to handle PII appropriately. For instance, it will address the circumstances under which PII may be shared and with whom. Now, in the NSI, keep in mind that the information included in your report of suspicious activity must be legally obtained. Secondly, make sure that you double-check your data for two things. Focus on including accurate and timely and complete information. Make sure that the information you are submitting is relevant to the identification of a subject or the subject's criminal conduct or activity. And make sure that you sufficiently provide context, facts, and circumstances to explain why you believe the behavior was suspicious. Lastly, make sure that your handling of PII is consistent with your organization's privacy policy. So with that, let's turn now to a discussion of civil rights. When we talk about civil rights, we're talking about an affirmative obligation of the government. By this, I mean the government has a duty to ensure the equal application of the law, regardless of an individual's race, ethnicity, religion, or other characteristics unrelated to the worth of the individual. The federal and state governments are prohibited from denying any person within the U.S. equal protection of the laws. Protection of these rights means that the government will take action to make sure that individuals are not discriminated against on the basis of any federally or state protected characteristic. Also keep in mind that the inappropriate use of these characteristics may constitute profiling. Now I'm referring to a discriminatory practice in which individuals are targeted by officials for suspicion of a crime based simply on the individual's race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. Profiling on these grounds simply is not effective, nor is it consistent with our constitutional values. So to mitigate these risks, the NSI focuses on observed behavior. To that end, you will need to articulate a factual basis for the suspicious behavior. This is important because it will help provide the context of the SAR and help downstream partners understand the meaning of the report. In addition, the NSI guidance that's adopted by fusion centers and incorporated in their policies proscribes the use of race, ethnicity, gender, national origin, religion, and other characteristics as factors creating suspicion. This information must not be included in reports about suspicious behavior. There's a single exception to this rule, and that is if the information is relevant to a specific suspect identification. In that situation, then it may be included. Let's turn now to a brief discussion of civil liberties. When you hear this term, think Bill of Rights. Think first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. These amendments offer protection to individuals from improper government action and arbitrary governmental interference. Given our limited time together, I'm going to focus only on the First Amendment during today's discussion. The First Amendment guarantees the following 5 basic freedoms: speech, religious expression, free assembly, press, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievance. So what are some examples of protected activity that you may encounter? Protests, religious activities, reading materials, membership in or association with political, religious, or other organizations. Now, the First Amendment protects expression, and this includes personal belief, opinion, and action. It includes the right of individuals to support a cause, the right to hold particular beliefs, even if those beliefs are disagreeable, offensive, outrageous, insulting, or even morally repulsive. In other words, the government cannot silence and punish speakers just because it doesn't like their expression. Now, it's very important for you to understand that information cannot be based solely on political, religious, or social views, associations, or activities. Mere expressive speech and affiliation are protected activities that are inherently not indicative of a criminal act and should not be considered suspicious activity. We have to focus on the individual's behavior. So ask yourself whether the individual's membership in or adherence to a certain set of constitutionally protected beliefs is relevant to an understanding or explaining the observed behavior. Now, just to give you a couple of things to remember, make sure that you're objective and even-handed towards similarly situated groups. Use care when selecting language regarding expressive conduct and associations. Stay neutral and even-handed in doing so. Clearly articulate why you think the behavior is suspicious and recognize the right to express unpopular, different, or even extreme opinions. Now, I'd like to return to Monte's discussion on the behaviors and just highlight a couple of points. Pay attention to the 2 different categories. It may be that you have multiple behaviors that you will be reporting on. If one or more of those behaviors is considered in the right-hand category, is one of the behaviors and is potentially criminal or non-criminal in nature, then if your report contains PII, it's incumbent on you to explain why this behavior is something other than innocent. You need to explain why you believe it's suspicious, clearly explain why you think it's suspicious, articulating the context, facts, and circumstances. But make sure that you adhere to this requirement because it's going to improve your product and allow the downstream reader to understand why you think it's suspicious. And last, here's a takeaway for you. I think that you can print this out and post it in a convenient place. It summarizes many of the key points that I shared with you today. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And Steve, back to you.
Okay, and we do have some questions. Some people fear reporting suspicious activities, even though it can prevent serious attacks. How can we reassure the public about this? Jen, can you take that one?
Absolutely. I think that outreach is important when we are transparent in what we're doing and how we're making our decisions. I'm not talking about the content of our reports, but rather our policies and our procedures. That transparency and outreach with community helps foster trust with the community and confidence in suspicious activity reporting.
Where can I find more detailed information about privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties?
Well, there are two links, two places that I can refer you to. The Office of Justice Programs Global Information Sharing Toolkit offers a wide range of materials relevant to federal, state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement practitioners, and also the privacy, civil rights, civil liberties subject matter experts. These materials cover operational matters. They cover various types of technology and policy guidance, templates, and best practices. So for this website, you can access it at https://it.ojp.gov. And the other website I would refer you to review the, to get resources on the Privacy, Civil Rights, Civil Liberties framework, you can visit the NSI's homepage. And for that, you may access https://, oh, it's up on the screen, nsi.ncirc.gov.
Thanks, Jen. My agency doesn't have an official policy on sharing terrorism information with other agencies. Where should I report the information? Maybe Monte or Phil on that one?
This is Phil. I'll take that. So, yeah, first off, we would encourage every agency to contact your Fusion Center, find out who they are if you're not already familiar with them, and make some arrangements for them. We would also encourage you to get your agency to develop some type of process for sharing that. It's also important, particularly with schools, with all the school shooting stuff going on, that every school have a process of how they handle all suspicious activity reports, whether it's terrorism or school-related, either way, to do that. But if at the very minimum, make contact with your Fusion Center or your law enforcement agency that services your area to make sure you have an understanding with them and hopefully some written protocols on how to do this.
And this will be our last question. This came in during the registration process. Somebody asked, connection between this effort and the legal limits on actions that can be taken if a subject has not committed a crime and or met the legal requirements for involuntary mental health hold. Anyone?
Jen, do you want to take that?
So Monty will take a stab at it, Steve. So if we think, or if a person suspects there's a mental health issue or a mental health problem here versus crime, then I would also refer you back to your college or university policy on that. I'm sure that most educational entities have policies about how to help a student in need in that regard. There is sometimes that challenge of making that distinction of, is this a mental health problem, or is it a crime problem, or is it sometimes both? And so through a local assessment process, then I would hope that protocol is already in place or can be put in place to begin that assessment process, and in particular where that is not a criminal issue whatsoever, to get that student or whoever that person might be the help that they need.
Thanks very much, Phil, Monty, and Jen, and thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page for a link to the captioned recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to our speaker slides. The brief evaluation survey I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please do. We read and act on your comments. The next Campus Public Safety Online webinar will take place from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, September 18th, featuring Angela Banta and Amy Juneau. Angela is a lieutenant in the East Baton Rouge, Louisiana Sheriff's Office, and Amy is an investigator with the Special Victims Unit of the Louisiana State Police. Their profoundly important topic is human trafficking, what your campus needs to know. The registration URL is on your screen and clickable, or surf on over to the National Center webpage at nccpsafety.org. That's nccpsafety.org. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety with support from the University of Vermont Continuing and Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Andrea Young and Dan Cardella. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.